Hi, I'm Brian Kite, Interim Dean of the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television, and I am so glad you are joining us for this Bruin family experience. We have a treat for you today with Professor Dominic Taylor, but first, a little bit about the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. We have two departments in the school, the Department of Theater and the Department of Film, Television, and Digital Media. We serve over 700 majors studying animation, cinema and media studies, cinematography, producing, production directing, screenwriting, acting, design for theater and entertainment, theater directing, playwriting, theater and performance studies. We award several degrees, a Bachelor of Arts, a Master of Arts, Master of Fine Arts, and a PhD. A little bit about Professor Taylor. Dominic Taylor is a writer and director and scholar of African American theater whose work has been seen across the country, and he is currently the acting chair of our Department of Theater in the School of Theater, Film, and Television. He most recently completed a Sloan Foundation commission for Ensemble Studio Theater for his play Biology of the Surface. He's a former associate artistic director of Penumbra Theater Company in St. Paul, Minnesota, one of the premier African American theaters in the country. Before he came to UCLA, he was an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. He also taught at Bard College and City University in New York, Columbia College in Chicago, Bennington College, and Brown University. Professor Taylor is an alumnus member of New Dramatist. He received his bachelor's and Master of Fine Arts degree from Brown University and is a member of the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society and the Dramatist Guild. I asked him, Dominic, what are you up to lately? He said, I've been leaning into Zoom, and he has. He'll soon be a part of a new play, which is being developed at the Playwright Center in Minneapolis in January. And I was lucky enough to attend a reading that was just done of his piece, Cell Surface for Black Lives, Black Words. And it was a terrific evening. I really enjoyed spending some time watching that play come to life over Zoom in these difficult times for theater. His talk today is about performance of an American identity. He's one of our extremely popular professors, and his lectures are always packed. So I am sure you'll enjoy what you're about to see. Please enjoy your time with my good friend and colleague, Professor Dominic Taylor.
Hi, welcome. What I'm going to talk to you about today is performance, but not performance generically, performance as the central engine of American identity. And American identity is always a contested place, not just in contemporary times, it's been contested since the beginning of the nation. And the role that performance has played has been crucial, and I argue is central to understanding what American identity is. So first, I'll start with a simple definition of identity. It's the fact of being, or what a person or an object is. And one of the great things about America from its foundings is we've always had a series of questions like, what is America? Like, what is this landmass? Now, I start by teasing out the question. The first part that you have to tease out is, when did America start? So I am not in any way ignoring the 500 nations that were here upon the 15th century discovery of this new landmass. And I don't mean in any way to be insensitive to that, nor am I going to ignore, although this will play a major piece, the Jamestown settlement and the subsequent enslavement of people starting in 1619 that happened on this landmass. But one of the things that I'm going to start looking at, or that we're going to look at in terms of performance, is how identity deals with America as a nation state. And so one of the great things about performance or theater is, theater is the viewing place. And I always argue, well, what are the things that we see? And are we seeing the same thing? And one of the fascinating things about American culture is our story is a significant part of it, but our story is predicated on how we view our story. So in terms of American identity, one of the earliest images that we had as a nation state was emerging. So I want to do a timeline thing. 1776 is the Declaration of Independence, which is significant. We weren't a nation state, but that begins a lot of our query going forward. 1789 is the Constitution, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But in the 17th century, going into the 18th century, their American identity was built around a few things that performance became central in. And the first type of performance, and it's not a stage performance, was the political cartoon. And so there is a character or a known being known as Brother Jonathan. So Brother Jonathan was the definition of a New Englander by and large. And Brother Jonathan was the juxtaposition with John Bull, who was the British counterpart. So Brother Jonathan had a lot of qualities in a political cartoon, and he took the stage in 1787 as a character in a play called The Contrast by Royal Tyler. One of the significant things about the emergence of Brother Jonathan as a character on stage was that a lot of the stuff, the qualities that the political cartoon had morphed into an actual person, an actual being. So I'll talk about the political cartoon. Brother Jonathan was a tricky person, and I have an image of Brother Jonathan, and he had striped pants. And Brother Jonathan emerges in a bunch of ways. He was a kind of a trickster, kind of a rough-hewn person, and he was a rough-hewn person in The Contrast. But his role in The Contrast started to emerge one of the great qualities of American life. So um, in The Contrast by Royal Tyler in 1789, Brother Jonathan is a character who is the waiter for Colonel Manley. Now, Brother Jonathan's not a perfect person. The reason why he called himself a waiter was because he didn't want to indicate that he was a servant. A servant, as he said, was for the negras, so he wasn't a perfect person. But what um, Brother Jonathan did is he was the juxtaposition of Jessamy, who was the servant for Mr. Dimple. But the point of Jessamy versus Jonathan is that Jonathan is a plain-spoken, hardworking, forthright individual. He doesn't want to put on airs. He wants to be a simple person. One of the great lines in the play, after Jessamy talks about the quality of person or a high quality of person, Jonathan says, "Why, I swear we don't make any great matter of distinction between quality and other folks." Because the notion is that Brother Jonathan is this um, honest, hardworking, forthright person. And in The Contrast, one of the reasons for the play and one of the reasons for the success of the play is um, Manley and Jonathan were really the juxtaposition of these European people who put on airs, and these are down to earth people, if you want to even hold on to that notion. And Brother Jonathan has an interesting career in terms of his stage development in the American theater. And what happens is Brother Jonathan morphs into Uncle Sam as time goes on, as we move through the 18th century, going into the 19th century on stage. And there is a character named Uncle Sam that starts to emerge at the beginning of the 19th century. Uncle Sam is a problematic character in some ways in terms of that character's play life, but his relationship to Brother Jonathan is very significant. Now, the other thing about Brother Jonathan, which I'm going to get back to, is this plain spoken person, this image that is part of American maleness translates up until today. It moves into the 21st century. Now, one of the things which I also think is interesting, and this is where the conflation between performance and social structures or social life start to emerge, is so we have this being on stage, which is a person who is honest, hardworking, a juxtaposition to this European being, this putting on airs thing. And then we have the social structure which starts to emerge. So in our terms of our social structure, as I'm sure you all know, in 1789, we as a nation have this little document that we call the Constitution. And so one of the things about the Constitution as a document is it is a compelling document, and most people don't think of it as a document that has anything to do with performance. But I might argue, okay, the Declaration of Independence was a performative document. So what I mean by this is the Declaration of Independence was a document that was written to be spoken by town criers or spoken to people in the streets so that they can understand where we are and where we were in 1776. That's significant. In terms of the Constitution, it is a compelling document because what it does is it foregrounds the notion of what identity is in a performative space. So, and this is personal performative space. So I am going to actually go into the Constitution quickly. And, I'm sure some of you know it really well because everybody has their pocket Constitution. And actually, when I teach, I actually give students a pocket Constitution. And I also have them read the Declaration of Independence, which is actually really funny as a moment of performance and try to figure out what people remember after they hear the Declaration of Independence. But yeah, so the Constitution is the first document that marks performance, or marks particularly the performance of an American identity, which is crucial to what I'm talking about or what I'm dealing with in terms of this little chat. So as we know from Schoolhouse Rock or from the wonderful civics classes that we had in school, the Constitution begins, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." So this is an attempt to pay back debt to the French and to build a nation state. But particularly for us, or for me, it starts with a pronoun that has no antecedent. And when I was in school, elementary school, a million years ago, when I was in second grade or something like that, and I said to the teacher, "We all love the New York Knicks." And she said, "Who is we?" And I said, "Us." And she said, "Well, everybody doesn't love the New York Knicks. Like, why do you assume that we all love the New York Knicks?" And I said, "Oh." And her point wasn't, that one should like a sports team. Her point was that when you start a sentence, a pronoun that doesn't have an antecedent, you need to clarify it quickly. You need to clarify who the we is. So in the Constitution, and it's Article 2, and it has been amended, and we all know that it's been amended. But Article 2 Article 1, Section 2, forgive me, is where the performance of self and American selfhood becomes clear. Article 1, Section 2 reads, third paragraph, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to the representative numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons." So in this little moment where they're trying to find the enumeration to determine the representation of persons for the House of Representatives, this is where American identity, or the performance of American identity, becomes significant. Now, I know the gender piece wherein free persons, they're talking about persons who own land or men, which is significant. But the other thing that I think is really important, you add the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years. So that's indentured servants, and white men. Excluding Indians, so the 500 nations of indigenous people who are here, they've excluded. So those people are clearly not Americans. Those are not Americans. So we've got white men and we've got white men who are indentured servants. And then we have 3/5 of all other persons. 3/5 of all other persons, then it becomes, well, who are those persons? Like, who are those other persons? And as we all know, that those persons were the enslaved individuals that people didn't want the South to have a disproportionate number of representatives. And there's a whole thing about that negotiation that happened to come up with the 3/5 fraction with all of its problems. However, what it does is it made phenotype crucial to American identity. It made how you look crucial to the American identity. So one of the questions that happens early is, well, who are those 3/5 persons? And if you don't look Black, for lack of better language, you become one of those free persons, or you become an indentured servant. This is long before Nella Larson wrote the book on passing. This becomes long before colorism becomes a concept in the 1960s that people deal with. What it does nationally is that American identity, or the notion of who could be an American, is based on who wasn't Black in some significant way, which is really kind of, if you were Black, you're 3/5 of a being, African American or an enslaved African. So that's a really important piece when we're talking about American identity and how performance of identity manifests itself. So when you have a person on stage, that person has to look white or has to look markedly in a certain way for that to be read by an audience in America. So one of the interesting things about I don't know, humans, Americans, human beings, is that, you know, we have rules, we have laws, and then we do whatever we do with these rules and laws. Like we amend them, we can change them. And in terms of the performance of self, the performance of self might not go hand in hand with the rules that we have placed down. And subsequently, a lot of black codes had to happen for different reasons. But I want to stay with theater for a second. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the American journey is how human beings decide to engage in their theater. So in 1821, there is, or there was, I should say, a theater group called the African Grove. Actually, they were called the American Theater, but a reviewer in the in the New Herald called them the African Grove because the theater was set on near Minetta Lane, and it was an African Grove ice cream parlor. So they called the theater the African Grove, but it was not called the African Grove. It was called the American Theater, and it was founded by this gentleman, James Hewlett, and another gentleman, William Alexander Brown. So one of the things, and part of the reason why I always share the image of James Hewlett is this is James Hewlett performing Richard III in a production. And they performed in 1821 and through 1823. And one of the things that I think is compelling about them as theater makers is they were a troupe of Black actors, African-based actors. And on one day, they were doing Richard III, and the Park Theater was also doing Richard III. And the Mr. Price, who owned the Park Theater, paid ruffians and the police to come in and arrest the company. And they arrested the complete company and put them in the watch house. They arrested the complete troupe. And as the story was told in the newspaper, they were taken to the watch house and they were speaking in blank verse for a long time to the wee hours. And they were only released from prison if they agreed never to perform Shakespeare again. And one of the things which I think is interesting about that is not that Shakespeare was held as an American identity space, but it was clearly held as a performance space that this group of persons, the police and Mr. Price and the Park Theater, thought, whether it's competition or otherwise, Black bodies cannot hold the Shakespeare. They can't hold Richard III. Now, the African Grove Company did a bunch of other really interesting plays in terms of their time and where we were. And one of the interesting plays was King Shotaway, which is a play about the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, which was Haiti. And they did this play in 1821, and the Haitian Revolution ended in 1804, so it's still in contemporary time. And of course, as we all know, slavery still existed in the United States. But the thing that I think is important in terms of our discussion about American identity and American identity holding a performative space is that this performance was so radical, repugnant, challenging, that they had to arrest them and demand that they never perform Shakespeare again. Of course, they performed Shakespeare again. One of their company members, Ira Aldridge, went to Europe and became one of the first great American tragedians abroad. He had a wonderful career in Europe, didn't really come back to the States to perform. James Hewlett and William Alexander Brown, after their theater closed in Manhattan, they did like a lot of people, and they actually kept performing in Brooklyn. So they went to Brooklyn before Brooklyn was chic. But I mention this because this is the beginning of the 19th century. This is 1821. One of the things that also happens as we're in this beginning period of time, and now 1821 is interesting because we just had the War of 1812, in which we've really gotten away from our British connection. Like in party with the French, we've really like broken away. So now this is a social structure, not a performance structure. But I do think that it's interesting that we're starting to build what it is to be an American and how is American shown to us continually. As I think about this notion, I also think that it's interesting that shortly after this became America's first great entertainment export. And the first great entertainment export is the thing that has caused more consternation about American theater history than probably any single thing. It was the first great international export, and it was blackface minstrelsy. Now, one of the things about blackface minstrelsy as a mechanism of performance, Thomas Danforth Rice was the person known for his quintessential, internationally popular song, Jim Crow. And in Jim Crow, and I think that the image of James Hewlett is important, but in Jim Crow, Thomas Danforth Rice darkened his face, wore rags, and he was this person. So one of the things about Jim Crow as a um, performance mode or performance modality is that T.D. Rice, who is not from the South, born in Ohio, decided that this was going to be a way for him to, how do I say it, for him to become successful. He became successful doing this form of performance. Now, one of the things about this mode of performance is blackface minstrelsy, and he's not the first person to do it. Charles Matthews was a European who either the year before or perhaps 2 years before, 1829, had a blackface show called A Trip to America. But I often think that one of the reasons why I think performance is the central engine in understanding American identity is even something as simple or complex as Jim Crow. It's simple in that its performance mode is bass. It's complex in that its performance mode pushed social structures. Most people don't know what the Jim Crow South is, other than they think it's segregated water fountains. No one thinks that Jim Crow was a performance that was 100 years prior to those segregated water fountains. Like, most people aren't putting two and two together with that. And so one of the things about this challenge is it is compelling to think about what this thing did for America. Not to see that, the easy answer is that it's racist. But the other thing which I always hold on to is that it is compelling to think about how human beings construct their identity. And identity space construction is fraught with a bunch of stuff. Like, how do we figure out what is an American, and how do we figure out our identity, period, full stop? So I will say, whether you think about it personally or collectively, one of the mechanisms of identity construction is whether or not we think about it positively or negatively. So I want to be, there is an idea that human beings construct an understanding of God. So now I'm going from identity to God or theology, apophatically, apophatic. And what that is we don't know what God is. We know what God is not. So we don't know what God is, but we know what sin is. So you shouldn't sin. So I construct a negative theology, for lack of a better phrase. So it's negative theology. So I don't know what an American is, but I know what an American is not. So if I think about it in a negative theology space, Jim Crow is holding on to that thing that says, oh yeah, that's how I construct an identity. I don't really know what it is, but I know it's not that. I know if I'm not that, or if I have the ability to take off that, I can become an American robustly. Now, the other way of thinking about theological understanding is cataphatic, Cataphatic. And in that space, we're thinking positively about where we are as human beings. We're thinking about, for lack of better words, our values and our structures. And so one of the beings that I say when I'm thinking about American values positively is, and in this one, although I don't like to hold, this is just an example of a Jimmy Stewart moment. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. One of the reasons why I hold on to this is Jimmy Stewart, when I talk about Brother Jonathan, is perhaps the Brother Jonathan model. It's a Wonderful Life, good, hardworking person, plain-spoken person. I mean, Jimmy Stewart did have some other roles in his career, but the ones that mark him, the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the It's a Wonderful Life, those kind of roles in which people's like, oh, Jimmy Stewart, he's such a nice guy. Jimmy Stewart's artistic child, so to speak, is Tom Hanks, in terms of all of those roles. I know he just did Mr. Rogers, but before that, Forrest Gump is an example of someone who might be a brother Jonathan with a slower mechanism, with slower ticking mechanisms, so to speak. But he is in that same brother Jonathan mode, positive thinking, hard worker, somebody who is going to hold on to this positive space, as opposed to the other side, wherein we're thinking about the negative theology. And it's like I'm thinking about an anti-Black construction. Now, without belaboring this thing, one of the things that I think is important about what happens, or how in the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, we deal with these modes. There are a lot of people who have constructed hardworking, straightforward pieces. Heidi in the Heidi Chronicles by Wendy Wasserstein is a great example of one. I mean, I think that Arthur Miller, even before that in the 1950s, where you can't throw away the Willie Loman character, the hardworking character, although he's diluted, is somebody who is an interesting person to hold on to. Kathleen Collins' play, 1970s play called The Brothers, is another interesting kind of work. There are people who move through the world in which you're like, oh no, if you work hard, you can achieve something, or if you're a diligent person and you hold these American values, these things can be positive. But one of the things which is really tough, or a challenge, is what happens when Black bodies hold these performance modes? What happens when Black bodies decide, or bodies of others hold these performance modes and these performance ideas? And so one of the things which I mentioned about Jimmy Stewart is every president since the 1940s. Now, I probably should back up and say a few things about the positive and negative theological construction of American identity in terms of media. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was a film in the 40s. The beginning of cinema, the first great film that so many people hold on to, is Birth of a Nation, which is the other side of this argument. Birth of a Nation, as you know, or maybe you don't know, was originally titled The Klansman. It was a novel that became a stage piece that subsequently became a major motion picture, and some argue the first great American movie. The challenge about that is the hero in The Klansman the hero in Birth of a Nation is a Klansman, is a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And they are coming to save the dignity of a young white woman. So it's a problematic space, but that's the cinema has shaped our identity in so many ways that we can't fully fathom. But the challenge of us holding on to that is, how do we own that personally? Jim Crow is a different ownership, because one of the things that Minstrelsy did is everybody was singing Jim Crow songs. Jim Crow songs are still in part of our everyday parlance. If you think about Jimmy Crack Corn, Oh Susanna, Old Kentucky Home, all of those songs have these really negative lyrics for African Americans. They're unbelievably, but the negative lyrics are only framed because we're trying to hold on to some kind of American notion. Cinema and television have done two really interesting things. Cinema, the birth of cinema in the 20s and coming into this century now. What it has done is it has held up the single person who is a hero in his own journey, whether or not you're talking about, Rambo or G.I. Jane or Clint Eastwood in a bunch of movies, or Charles Bronson. There's a bunch of cinema spaces in which we have one person who is a hero. That person who's the hero, who fights off the bad people, might be somebody of integrity, might not be somebody of integrity, but he, she, or they are always fighting by themselves, and that's a different American mode. What I'm really talking about are the values inside some of these characters. And the thing that I think that I want people to hold on to is the Jimmy Stewart, the brother Jonathan character, is a manifestation that has existed through all American presidents up until the present one. And I do think that there's a reason why that exists. I think that television has done a similar thing, although I do think that television's biggest marker or maker in terms of American identity had to be the push for the nuclear family and all of its manifestations. The notion of these two parents and these 2.5 kids are part of the televisual space, in part because coming out of the 1950s and selling soap and and doing these things. The nuclear family is probably better held in that space than in the cinematic space. But let me go forward. So we have Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We have this brother Jonathan character who keeps emerging and keeps pushing through in terms of American identity. And so, I mean, what we all know has happened is, you know, we had the quintessential brother Jonathan in terms of Barack Obama. And one of the things which is fascinating, if you look at presidential candidates and how they operate, and this is one thing that I think is crucial about how we perform, not just president, but how we perform notions of Americana. Barack Obama, like George Bush before him, like Bill Clinton before him, like Jimmy Carter before him, you had these moments wherein you could have had a shot from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. There's a moment in which Ronald Reagan or anyone has rolled up their sleeves and they're tossing some hay, or they're hardworking people, although we know they're not doing this. But there's this notion that they are these men always who are honest, hardworking Americans who will quite literally roll up their sleeves to help you. They will roll up their sleeves to help you. Now, in terms of the engine that is performance, Barack Obama did perform this very well. I mean, he performed it better than most. I mean, he's two-term president, so his performance of "I'm going to roll up my sleeves and help you" is part of his, for lack of a better word, legacy. This is the Affordable Care Act. Similar, but very different to 1821, where you had these African-based people performing this Shakespeare. America, and I understand that more people voted for Hillary than voted for Mr. 45, has decided we're going to elect somebody who is counter to all of these things. We're going to elect somebody who's very different. And it's interesting or compelling to think of what that says about who we are as Americans, or American identity, or the performance of American identity. The performance of self, or the performance of identity, comes from the notion of beingness, and of course, how we manifest this beingness in the public sphere. And our leaders are supposed to reflect in some way who we are as Americans. And this is the interesting thing about where we are as a people. Now, it is hard, and as any academic will tell you, all of this stuff is hypothesis on my part. Like the notions that I do think that, good Senator Clinton, when she was running for office, did a similar thing, went to the Iowa Fair, was engaged in this notion that I can be there to work with you as opposed to you working for me, which is really different. Although gender politics was huge with that, and that's the reason why that thing became something else. But I do want to hold on to a couple of things, or I want you to think of a couple of things as I'm about to go into my ending about American identity and American identity construction. There are a couple of things that I want you to hold on to. One is there something to be said for either a positive or a negative theology for us to construct our identity? Do we presently, and whether this is individually or collectively, decide that these are the values and this is the way in which I manifest my values, and I am going to have a positive theology, like I'm going to hold this, hard work, honesty, fair play. These are my principles, and these are the ways in which I'm going to manifest these principles. Or do I do this other thing where I say, I really don't know what being an American is, but I know what being an American is not. Now, to bring this to the 2020 immediate moment, COVID land where we are right now, I posit something else. Now I'm taking an individual thing and I'm making it bigger. So one of the questions that I've asked myself, and I think a lot of us have asked this question, is like, why can't Americans wear masks? So this. Now I know that this is a jump, so I don't want to lose anyone with my jumping. The first thing that we have to deal with performance is the notion that the performance on stage, whether it's Brother Jonathan in Royal Towers of Contrast, or Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, or it's anyone, it's like there is a moment of which I need to be conscious of, like, that's a performance, and its reality or its relationship to real life is something else. However, social structures emerge around these performances. The most robust one, or the most tragic one, is Jim Crow. The performance was simple, the manifestation was gigantic. And it actually was a huge, it was gigantic in so many ways, and it changed people's careers and lives. Um, Stephen Foster, who wrote a lot of classic songs, wrote a bunch of minstrel songs, and had he not turned to the making of that sheet music, he would have been working with his cousin, I believe, as an accountant, either cousin or brother. I have to check my notes about who he was, but he was accountant. And then he decided that making songs was easier, and then making these type of songs was really easy. However, I don't know if it's negative theology or positive theology, but one of the things that I'm fascinated by is like, so how does this performance manifest itself today? And this is, BBC had an article about this, and I do think that one of the things which is interesting is that we don't need no stinking masks. We don't need no stinking masks. What's America's problem with the mask? Now, I said to someone, half joking but half serious, there's got to be a performance mode that is the reason why these people are fighting about masking. And then I totally forgot one simple thing. The largest moment that has happened in the last 20 years, although we're at the edge of the 20 years moment, although COVID is going to take over now, was the attack on 9/11. And one of the things about the attack on 9/11, what the attack on 9/11 did was it reinvigorated that us them question. And one of the things about the us them question, who is us and who are they? Who are the good people, who are the bad people? Who's on our side and who's on their side? And aside from going into these wars, one of the things which I realized is, because I lived in New York at the time, two things that I found fascinating was it wasn't just people who were Muslim, it was people who performed being other. Even if you weren't Muslim, I tell the story, which is true. I was directing a show in New York City, a show called Upper Creek, and it was supposed to open on 9/11. We opened on 9/12. And after, we were on 23rd Street. And after opening, all of these Sikh cab drivers would be in front of the theater to give people rides home. And no one would get in their cars. And this was 23rd Street, and I was living on 150th Street. So I got in a gentleman's car, and he didn't want to take any fare from me. He wanted to show how good he was as an American. So he had flags on his car. And I said, but you're a Sikh. Don't people know this? He's like, no, people see the turban and they think that you're a Muslim. And so inside this, I also realized that the burqa became a huge piece of public contestation for all of us. So that the notion that your mouth is hidden, although this is a gendered space, became this real problematic moment. So aside, this is about politics. I was going to say this isn't about politics, but one of the things that I want to think of is this is about the performance of the moment. The challenge with the mask has to do with this notion or this idea that to be an American, you should not have your mouth covered. To be an American, you should not in any way cover your mouth. Now, I understand that is ridiculous on so many levels, but one of the things which is so compelling when I think about the ridiculous nature of that is, it is as ridiculous as somebody turning about, wheeling about, and jumping Jim Crow. Entirely as ridiculous. The other thing which I think, although I conflate the masking and burqas as part of this, I also think that one of the things which I know I elided and I should have made mention of, and I should go back to and make mention of over and over again, is the other thing that happens inside minstrelsy, or that happened inside minstrelsy, is since it predated vaudeville, the notion of men in drag, Tony Pastor, there are other people who are really prominent in that space. The notion of femininity performed grew out of that moment. Before Uncle Milty was wearing a dress, these guys were wearing dresses and they were becoming successful, albeit success meant they were earning a lot of money as Black women. And if you ever see anything, Anne Marie Bean has this great essay about double inversion, in which you can't imagine how illogical these men looked as women, but they performed this femininity in a way that marked what femininity was. And so it became another marker. So as they were marking race, they were also marking gender. But let me stay near the end of my piece. So I think one of the things that we ask ourselves, and I continually ask this question, well, what is it to be an American, and how do we mark that stuff about being an American? And when someone says to me, well, Dominic, being an American has to do with those first people who showed up on the shore and they came to the Jamestown colony in 1607. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So, what happened with those people? A lot of those people, unfortunately, died in the frost of 1617. And a lot of those people who died in the frost of 1617 needed to find people who weren't Americans who could work for them and work for the Jamestown colony. And they, fortunately or unfortunately, purchased a bunch of slaves in 1619. And that became the beginning of an entire trajectory of what it was to be an American, or what it was, or how work operated in America, which is also really important when we're thinking about identity and how America manifests itself in the 21st century. I mean, the only reason for the thought, the only reason for my talk, and the only reason why I introduced this idea in the early parts of my African American theater class, I also introduce this thought when I'm talking about playwriting or directing, is that it is compelling to think not just about my conjectures about where performance situates itself, but your personal conjecture on how you shape or build your own identity. America is a 400-year-old problem that is going to continue to be a problem, and I don't know where it is going to end. I hope it ends positively. But you, as an individual, anybody, has to start to ask yourself, so, okay, so now I'm trying to figure out who I am. What is my identity? How do I perform self? And so whether or not I'm thinking about masking or not masking or shielding or not shielding, or even, larger things, it's like, how do I define myself? And so I'm defining myself based on a series of performed behaviors, but are those performed behaviors predicated on me thinking positively about what it is to be Black or woman or whatever series of identities I want to hold on to? Or is it really about not being that other thing? Do I build my identity predicated on, I just don't want to be like that? So for me to be fill in the blank identity space for myself, do I really know how my culture operates? Do I really know how the behavior, practice, and beliefs and values of myself and my people, and I can figure out exactly what those things are? Or are they still in conjecture? It's okay if they are in conjecture, but I do think that if you want to hold on to the theology piece, because I know a lot of people have faiths or faith spaces, one of the most interesting books that I've ever read in terms of understanding self, or understanding the journey of life. So if I want to say, the Book of the Dead by Budge has a series of negative confessions. And this is not where I shape my identity, but this is where I shape my journey through life, which I think is kind of compelling or fascinating as I put my body into this journey of life. The first negative confession, back up. The negative confessions, the Book of the Dead, you're weighing your heart versus a feather. Goddess Maat has your heart, and she's weighing it against a feather. And the first negative confession is, I have seen nothing in the world but beauty. I have seen nothing in the world but beauty. And so I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to weigh my heart against that? Oh, and you have to tell the truth. And if you're telling an untruth, your heart is too heavy. And so whether or not I think about Dylan Roof or Japanese internment camps or ICE detention, ICE hysterectomy, like for me to go and to think that I live in a world in which these things exist, and then I have to challenge myself with that. And so then I build my identity by saying, I don't know if I'm a good person, but I'm not putting any kid in a cage, or I'm not interning any Japanese people right now, or they weren't even Japanese people. That was the other kind of fascinating thing about performing American identity. It was anyone who looked East Asian in anybody's idea, so that those people became part of the internment issue. But I do think that it's one of the challenges for myself to say, oh yeah, every time I build my identity, I'm not going to build it in an apophatic way. I'm not building negative identity. I'm not building my identity in that way. I'm trying to think of the values, the things that are proactive and positive for me to go forward with, as opposed to going in terms of a negative space. Then when I get outside of myself and I want to become more culturally connected, I do ask how my country or my city or my location is building its identity. And I still think that the performance of self and the performance of of positive space is one of those things. I will tell you, as I'm about to close, one of my challenges in theater perpetually is not to have conflict as the center of my drama. I love tension, but I don't necessarily know I need to have conflict. And so tension manifests itself in all of these great ways that can happen in theater. And one of the great plays or performance modes is arguably one of the greatest plays ever written at the end of the 20th century, for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, spelled ENUF. But the reason why it's one of the great plays is there are 7 women in that play. There is no protagonist. There is no antagonist. There is tension available. It is a moment of ritual and sharing and performance that Ntozake Shange put together that is so fascinating and so compelling. And it makes me consider that all those 7 women at the end of that moment are on a journey towards identity, and their performance, the process of that performance, has led them to that. So the final thing is that the process of your daily performance is going to lead you to an identity. It's going to lead us to a collective identity. The question is, how do you want us viewed? How do you want this viewed? How do you want us viewed? How do you want our time on the planet viewed? I think that America is, its identity is still in flux, and I'm hoping that we can stay in a positive theological space construction as opposed to a negative one. Thanks for listening to me for a little while. That's kind of how my second day of class goes. My first day of class is even more fun and complicated. Thanks, though.